Hello again, Biology 300 students. Mr. Parker here, and this is the Evolution Screencast session number 2, dealing with Darwin and natural selection. In the screencast, as you can see here, we're going to be looking at Darwin and his idea of natural selection, which is the driving force behind evolution. These birds that you can see here, the finch birds, these are Darwin is famous for. These are just a few of them. Throughout the Galapagos Islands, there were 13 different types of finch birds. And you can see here a few of the differences, but very easy to see is the beak size and beak shape, and how thick they might be. And then this is just dealing with them being better adapted to their environment and being able to be able to get the food resources that they need. Okay. Another organism here that's adapted. You can see the organism here kind of outlined here, who is obviously fitting in through kind of mimicry of the particular branch and leaves that's in that particular area. Pretty cool shot there of this particular organism. And basically nature will select for this because of its ability to camouflage within its environment. And here's another type of mimicry. You can look at two different butterflies, and one looks almost exactly like the other. And it's for selective purposes in order to be better adapted to its environment and be able to, its fitness increases this way to give the ability to survive and reproduce. All right, so kind of go along with Charles Darwin. There's a few other scientists that he used to help solidify his ideas of natural selection and basically of evolution. Okay, so the first scientist that you should jot down here is Charles Lyell, and he is famous for his book of Principles of Geology. And basically in this book, this is where Darwin realized that the Earth is old and that changes took place very slowly over time. And this is the information that he was able to take out of Charles Lyell's book that helped support his ideas of evolution and the change that occurs over time. And that it does typically takes a very long time in order for it to happen. The second scientist he looked at was a guy named Thomas Malthus. And in this Thomas Malthus's essay called The Principles of Population, Malthus stated that the populations will always grow larger than the food supply, okay, which obviously creates hunger for some organisms, and this creates this competition for survival, and some people will die, or some organisms will die, and some will live. Again, it's the competition for food. The ones that are better adapted to the environment are going to be able to reproduce and survive and pass along their genes to their particular offspring. So what Darwin had done to kind of help support or kind of figure out more information about this natural selection idea is he did something called artificial selection. Okay, and this is something that Darwin basically was one of the first people to go through and investigate, was the process of modification of a species through human action, which encouraged the breeding of certain traits over others. Okay, a lot of you probably have heard, if you're thinking about this, you're maybe you're possibly for dogs, certain breeders are breeding for certain types of dogs, a certain lineage. It's basically there's humans playing the role of this, putting together two species that they want to, or two organisms that they want to breed together, instead of letting nature take its course. And it's looking for certain traits. It could be dogs, it could be horses, it could be plants, like certain types of corn, certain types of cattle, pig, whatever it is. It's human interaction that's going to modify this. And through this process, you can see here a couple different modifications that occurred through these different organisms. Okay, the different dog breeds that I mentioned, they will go through this artificial selection process. Instead of letting them naturally come together, they will put two organisms together and breed them for particular reasons. Okay, so what Darwin learned from this artificial selection, you can see here, is three main points. When chosen organisms are mated, desired characteristics are formed. So when you pick two organisms that you want to mate for their particular traits, they will pass along their genes and they will create the organism that you might want. Now, you got to remember that Darwin did not at this time know about DNA and genes and all that stuff that we know now. So this is something new, something more for us. It's kind of common knowledge, but for Darwin at the time it wasn't. So when he picked these two organisms and put them together, they came up with the traits that he wanted. The second one here is when individuals in the wild who possesses the characteristics that make it more likely for them to reproduce will pass along these characteristics to their offspring, okay, and the desired characteristics are formed. So the first one kind of dealt with artificial selection, Down here, Darwin is dealing with the idea of natural selection, whereas out in the wild, these two organisms come together, their traits will be passed along. Okay, in the bottom here, the desired characteristics in the wild would be those which would enhance their survivability. So basically, which ones will become better adapted, which one will have the characteristic of its camouflage, if it's mimicry, if it's being faster or slower, whatever it is that makes them better adapted to their environment. Nature is going to select for those, and it's going to select out the ones that are not making them better adapted for their particular environment. Okay, so these are the three main points that Darwin learned from his ideas of artificial selection, working with the genes that he could control, and then taking that knowledge he learned from that and then applying it to nature and the idea of natural selection. Okay, I had mentioned this idea in the second scientist here, another scientist by the name of Lamarck. Okay, and he had thoughts on evolution too. Basically, what he stated that that organisms acquired characteristics from their particular parent that was passed on. So if an organism had an acquired characteristic, meaning it gained the characteristic during their lifetime, they could pass it along. In this example that you see here, Lamarck's view was this organism here, this particular organism, the giraffe obviously, the short-necked organism, over a period of time as it moves along, as these giraffes are stretching for the leaves that might be in the tops of the tree or a little bit higher than what they're, the food source is gone already, and continues on stretching. What Lamarck believed was if this original organism would stretch its neck to a point here, then this acquired characteristic could be passed on to his offspring. Okay. Now we know that's untrue because an acquired characteristic during a lifetime you can't pass on to your offspring. They have to be genetically linked. Okay. So Lamarck believed that you could pass along acquired characteristics. All right, like this particular example. All right, but Darwin's view here is that the giraffes with the longer necks got the more food, okay? And these giraffes that had the longer neck was due to some random mutation, where originally, most of the giraffes' necks were short, but there was one particular giraffe had a random mutation and a longer neck. It became better able to survive and reproduce because of this longer neck, could reach the food and survive, and then it would pass on these long neck traits to their genes or to their offspring. So these genes or the alleles became more frequent within the population, and those particular organisms, giraffes with longer necks, became more predominant because it increased its fitness, meaning it could survive and reproduce. So this adaptation that occurred randomly allowed the organism to survive and reproduce, and now is obviously the most popular type or the most dominant type of giraffe. Okay, and so Darwin traits were passed along by the genes. From parent to offspring, whereas Lamarck believed these acquired characteristics during one's lifetime could be passed on to their offspring. Okay, this is kind of showing the idea of the short neck versus the long neck. Okay. All right, so evolution through natural selection. Here's some key points that it kind of points out. There's variation in populations caused by genetics. Many more offspring are produced than can survive. Many die through predation or starvation. This again here, nature selecting out. Okay. Only the ones that are strong are going to survive. The ones better adapted for their environment are going to survive and be able to reproduce. Okay. Some variations are favorable and help organisms compete and survive. All right. So like the giraffe, the longer neck, that particular organism with a leaf that looks like a leaf, it's going to be able to survive and reproduce. These are favorable. Over time, the organisms with the favorable variations become plentiful. So like the giraffe, the long neck, originally the short neck was was predominant or the dominant trait. Now, over a long period of time, the giraffe's necks are the long ones are the predominant one, is because their adaptations makes them better suited for their environment. Okay, and there's all this information that he gathered from his research on artificial selection, natural selection, from his voyage on the HMS Beagle. He reluctantly published his book called The Origin of Species in 1859. You should definitely have that written down. What I mean by reluctantly, because this went against not only basically against the church, and the church in the 1800s was very, very influential in people's lives, and he was going directly against it and against a lot of other scientists, where most scientists at that time were looking at the idea of the story of Genesis and the creation of life, and he was going against the idea with natural selection and things evolving or changing over a period of time. through adaptations and random mutations that occurred. Okay, so the four main points of natural selection that you should definitely have written down is that variation is present in the population and the variation is inherited. Now, the reason I have genetic and genetically passed to offspring in parentheses is that at that time, remember, he did not know about DNA and he didn't really know about genes. Okay, so instead of saying variations, you can say genetically the genes is present in the population and the variation is inherited or passed on to the offspring. So you're passing the genes from one organism to the next. Okay, that living things over-reproduce. Okay, so if you think about it, living things are always overproducing. Think about the size litter of dogs and cats and other organisms. The reason is for if they're out in nature, these dogs, okay, when they reproduce, a majority of those organisms would not survive. You think about when turtles reproduce, they might lay 100 eggs, and only a few of them actually make it to the sea and actually are able to reproduce, or snakes or alligators, whatever it is. Okay, and those organisms tend to over-reproduce. The competition for limited resources. Again, this is going to help, or nature is going to select for the ones that are better suited or better adapted to its environment for that resources. It could be food, shelter, whatever it is, security that will what they're competing for. And the last point here is the survival of the fittest. And we're not necessarily meaning who's the strongest or the biggest, the most muscles, that kind of deal. We're meaning whatever organism is best suited for their environment, that have the adaptations they need. The random mutation has made them, has increased their fitness so they can survive and reproduce. Okay, so these are the four main points talking about variation. They over-reproduce, competition for food and resources, and the survival of the fittest. Okay, kind of a little bit more about the survival of the fittest is these are organisms who are better survived to produce larger numbers of offspring are considered more fit than who do not. So again, it's not who's the strongest and stuff. It's the ones who are better suited for their environment. And this is all done through adaptations and these random mutations that makes organisms better suited for their environment. They're able to do this reproduction process. Okay, so here I have a little statement from Charles Darwin. It says, "It is not the strongest species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the ones most responsive to the change." Okay, so if you're an organism and you're not responding to the change that's occurring within your environment or your ecosystem, you're not going to survive. Your species is not going to survive. It doesn't mean you have to be intelligent and be the strongest. It means you have to adjust or evolve or change over time. Okay, so for instance, it's showing you here this lion able to go off. It's being the survival of the fittest. Okay, now there's some organisms, some other lions will not be able to eat. Okay, so they will not be able to get to this point where they want to survive and reproduce their offspring. Okay, so again, the whole goal of every offspring is really to pass on their genes. And the whole goal of every organism is to reproduce. Okay, and what increases that fitness is the adaptations that occur through many generations. Okay, it makes them better equipped for this. Okay, the last picture here that I have on for this particular screencast natural selection is just kind of showing you how this is in action. Okay, you can see here, okay, this little what we call kind of like the peppered moth. See how it blends in there, and what happens is it causes the frequency of alleles in a population to increase or decrease over time. So, for instance, this particular organism, okay, a moth. Initially, most of them are actually white in this particular area, and what had happened was there was a random mutation that occurred to some of the moths, and they get this what they call more of a peppered look to them, and they could blend into their environment a little bit better. And because of this blending into the environment, and they wouldn't get kind of picked off by birds and stuff to eat, and the white ones that would stand out against that particular background. So these organisms, these moths, these particular set of moths would be able to reproduce. They survive more often. Okay, and they would be able to reproduce, and they would be able to pass along their genes or their alleles. And by them surviving and reproducing more often than the other version, then their alleles would increase in population and increase in frequency within the population, and then they would become more the predominant one. Just like the giraffe example, where the long neck was the lesser amount of organisms at the time, but then due to the fact of this random mutation, it increased their frequency, increased their alleles because it made them better equipped at surviving in the wild. Okay, so this is just kind of another picture here, kind of showing you where you have the light tree. You can see how they blend in. You can see here the whites versus the darks, so which ones are better equipped for their particular environments. All right, another picture, kind of a real picture. You can see first one, the top one is a lot easier, or it blends in a little bit more. So these organisms on top, okay, these would become the more predominant one because the alleles would allow them to blend in, allow them to survive and reproduce and have more offspring. Okay, so this was a screencast session number 2 for evolution, dealing with Darwin and natural selection, which is the driving force behind evolution, and the 4 main key points.